This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Today's podcast is also brought to you by The Athletic, premium coverage for passionate Detroit sports fans. Listeners can get 20% off the first year of an annual subscription by visiting theathletic.com/DSP.
Mo Wagner's legacy, Wolverine-style reality television, and Michigan completes spring football practice. All that and more coming up here on the season finale of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony. Waits for it. Yes, caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And the leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic. Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We'll win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team, and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Dace. Welcome to the season finale of Michigan Podcast. A lot to get to here this week. Mo Wagner moves on to the NBA. We look at his legacy and what a legacy he leaves behind for the Maize and Blue. Also, plenty on spring football, even though we didn't get a spring game because of the incredible weather we've been having throughout the Midwest. Really the worst April I can imagine and can remember. Michigan spring game, as well as several others, were canceled. So we didn't get a chance to see them for ourselves, but our good friend Michael Spath from WTKA right there in Ann Arbor has his ear to the ground of what's going on. He'll give us the 411 coming up a little bit later on. But we begin with reality TV, Wolverine style. Now, I should say from the outset, I've not yet seen the entire All or Nothing reality show on Amazon. I've seen 6 of the first 8 episodes. And the reason I'm a little behind is because I really didn't want to watch this. I was dreading it when they were promoting it was coming out. I was like, is there a way we could table this? We could cancel it, right? It just seemed like, why do you want to relive last season? It was one of the most joyless seasons I can remember as a Michigan fan. You know, at least in Rich Rod's first year when we were 3-9, you still kind of thought, well, you know, they're going to get better. They'll find a quarterback that can run this system, right? Last season reminded me of the end of the Hoke era and Dave Brandon and, you know, campus demonstrations and giving away tickets for a Coke Zero. It just, everything about last season was joyless after the Florida win. It was just abysmal. The non-conference wins over Cincinnati and Air Force weren't any fun. Then you had a brief glimmer of hope with the way the team performed at Purdue when John O'Korn came off the bench, and then the offense the rest of the way was a rock fight. It just seemed like every time you were buying in, this was going somewhere. The ground shifted underneath our feet. It was just, I'm not telling you anything if you're a Michigan fan. I'm not telling you anything you didn't live through, right? It was a joyless season. So to relive this again was not something I was anxious to do. And then it came out, and I started seeing some of the reaction that fans were having, including fans that, on message boards at places like the Michigan Insider and the Wolverine were pretty critical of where the football program was at. And I thought, all right, maybe I'll give it a shot. And as I've gone through the series, I just have to say, bravo. The University of Michigan got the final say in how to edit what we're watching. And whoever was involved in that, and I'm sure Coach Harbaugh was one of them. I would imagine somebody over at the Sports Information Department gave a little media consultation as well. Whoever, though, was a part of the team there in Ann Arbor that gave the final say in guiding Amazon on how to edit this, bravo. You have done one of the greatest, and I know some of you aren't going to understand that what I'm saying next is a compliment. Sincerely. It's not, a humble brag. It's not a back-assward compliment. It's not tongue-in-cheek. I am dead serious when I say this. This is very effective propaganda. Not all propaganda is bad. One person's narrative is another person's propaganda. See, what they did here, and if you haven't watched this series, I'd highly recommend that you do. What they did here is they didn't try and pretend last season didn't suck. That's what I was afraid of. We live in an era where it seems like a lot of our public leaders lack any form of self-awareness whatsoever. Nobody seems willing to say they were wrong about anything, even when the evidence is clear that they were. No one is willing to own up to being wrong, even when you show them right to their face, sometimes live on television. I mean, that's the era in which we live. Tribalism is all is tribalism. I was afraid Michigan might do that. We might go bunker here. We might double down. We might try to put lipstick on a pig. Nope. They gave us more access than I've ever imagined they would. And they were very honest, but as Obi-Wan once said to Luke Skywalker, from a certain point of view. It's almost like they looked at what the common social media message board theories as to what went wrong last season were among Michigan fans and used the editing of this reality show to check every box. Let me give you some examples. So some of the things we've talked about. Hey, what happened to Jim? Where's Jimmy? Where's the fire on the sidelines? Why does it look like he's on tranquilizer darts, right? They give us an episode where Jim is so despondent after the Michigan State game. Him and Sarah get up the next morning. I think it's to get the kids either to church, I'm guessing. And Jim can't get dressed. Sarah's trying to get the kids ready to go. Jim is in a daze. He's holding his infant. And it's just like he's not even there. And Sarah looks into the camera and says, I can't even sleep next to him after a loss. He wakes up in the middle of the night screaming things out. Like he's got PTSD. And you're like, yeah, that's our fiery Jim. That's our man. That's Jimmy right there. That's what we were looking for. The way the quarterbacks are portrayed. Early in the year, Wilton Speight seems way too sensitive. Clearly, he's not ready yet to lead a program. He's not ready to take a young team and put it on his shoulders. Later in the year, he seems much more mature, but by then he's injured and can't play. So we've got Wilton Speight complaining about what's getting said about him on Facebook and what Nick Baumgartner writes in the newspaper. John O'Korn seems to lack all self-awareness at all. I mean, talking about his NFL stock, and you're like, bro, for shizzle? Really? I mean, he seems like a great kid, but it just seems like, as, Han Solo once said, we're having delusions of grandeur here. All right. And then there is Brandon Peters. And remember, we were told he wasn't ready yet to command a team. And you see that because he calls plays in the huddle like he's calling out numbers at a DMV. 306, 198, license and registration. Look here. That's how he calls plays when you watch this. We're going veer right, 16, swing X, Y, Z on one. Ready? Break. That's not exactly leader of men stuff, right? So we see, the quarterbacks weren't that good. They weren't ready to lead the team. Offensive line, they're barely portrayed. Tim Drevno, who was one of their coaches, it's like he's not even there until episode 6. He gets a nice moment, but he's essentially written out because he's gone now. Pep Hamilton is highlighted a lot more because he's still here. You come across thinking Pep Hamilton is just a swell dude. You know, I mean, you think Pep Hamilton is the bee's knees, man. You're glad he stayed and Tim Drevno was gone. Greg Fry, the other offensive line coach, he's not even in the series. It's like he was never on our team. Tariq Black, you know, and we were told that his injury was huge because he was our best wide receiver despite being a freshman who had played in only 3 games ever. And we get a scene that was beyond the level of access. I didn't think they'd be this honest. When they find out Tariq Black is injured and done for the year, Jim walks right into the team meeting room and says to the team, well, we just lost our best wide receiver. I mean, you could go right on down the line. Every theory we posited in our comments section here on YouTube, on the message boards, on our social media accounts, everything we thought we were seeing, instead of fighting us, because here's what a lot of schools do when they have a bad season and the fan base gets antsy, as ours is right now. They make it look like you don't know what the hell you're talking about. No, I mean, these guys are great. Well, hey, if they're great, why'd we suck? Clearly we weren't great. Well, clearly the quarterbacks aren't good because, you know, we threw 9 touchdown passes for the whole year like it was 1975, and it was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. Clearly the offensive line wasn't great because we were like 110th in the nation in tackles for loss allowed. Right? I mean, that's what really gets fans mad too. You know, we don't know everything. The coaches always know more than us. But if you watch a lot, you're not dumb either. You may not be fully informed, but you're not uninformed. We can watch our guys not pick up stunts and get 3 quarterbacks killed in 1 year. We all watched that happen. We watched the ambulances take them away. We saw it. Don't act like we didn't see that. And I feared Michigan would do that because a lot of teams in these situations act like that. Instead, they were brutally honest. And with the exception of Brandon Peters, because he's only a redshirt freshman here when we played this season out, they conveniently blame this on everybody that's gone. Spath, O'Korn, offensive line coaches. It's brilliant how they did this. And now, you know, right after hockey lost to Notre Dame in the Frozen Four on a goal with 5 seconds left, it was like, crap, now we got to talk football. And it was such a nice reprieve not having to discuss football these last 4 months after the Outback Bowl. And then the very next day after the hockey lost, the Amazon documentary comes out, the reality show. And now all of a sudden you're like, you know, maybe they do know what went wrong. Well, they know what we thought went wrong, and they did a great job of affirming us, which creates empathy, which creates solidarity. It's brilliantly done. Now, if they go out and screw the pooch this fall, we're not going to remember any of this right now. But we were going to be pissed about that whether this documentary came out or not, right? So what they did do is they bought themselves 4 months here of an off season where suddenly it doesn't seem like the long slog of dreck that it seemed like on January the 2nd of this year. So bravo to the entire team at the University of Michigan who crafted this, who edited this. You come away, if you're a young recruit and you're watching this at home, you're like, you know, Harbaugh's pretty dope. You know, he relates well to guys one-on-one. He gives you inside info, inside access. And, you know, they just needed a better quarterback. And now they have one in Shay Patterson. They took a season that had existential questions prompted because of how it went down. And instead, they've changed the narrative to, you know, we just got caught in a year with a really young team and we didn't have a good quarterback. But now we have a more experienced team and we've got a 5-star transfer at quarterback in Shay Patterson. So all will be well. Now, that may not be the case when we go into South Bend the first Saturday night of the year. That may not be the case. But if the same people responsible for cleverly editing this documentary reality show were also responsible for reshaping Michigan's program after last season's debacle, then my confidence level is higher that they just might fix this thing in time to wake up the echoes for the maize and blue on September 1. If you're wondering, hey, how can I support what you guys are doing at Michigan Podcast? This is one way. You can support us on Patreon, and as you can see, every now and then, we are giving exclusive content to our Patreon supporters, including my thoughts on the championship game, which I actually thought Michigan was going to win, as well as the semifinal victory over Loyola. Several of you watching us this week on Michigan Podcast are already assisting us and supporting us on Patreon. Thank you so much. And yes, Even during the off season, we'll be updating with content for our Patreon supporters. So please consider supporting us at patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. Back here on the season finale of Michigan Podcast, joined by our good friend Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Go Blue. Michael, has spring arrived there in your neck of the woods yet?
God, no. No, absolutely not. In fact, I was just listening to some talk radio talking about a Detroit Tigers game that's going to be playing on Tuesday night, and they're expecting it to be about 31 degrees at game time. It's awful. And, I know that, if you listen to my show, we lament about it a lot, and maybe the people that live in other places are tired of hearing about it. But, this is an epic. This is once in 1,000 years. I was talking about that with floods and storms. This is the worst in 38 years of my life, the worst April I've ever experienced. And I've actually done some research on this because I was curious. And back in 1987, we had a brutally cold April too. So maybe the worst I've experienced in 30 years is a more accurate portrayal of what we're experiencing right now.
Well, it led to the cancellation of Michigan's spring game. We'll talk spring football towards the latter part of our conversation here today. But let's begin with Mo Wagner announcing that he will go on to the NBA. He will sign with an agent. And now it's time to assess his legacy. What is it, Michael?
We were discussing this a little bit earlier in the week, and I go back to really when you think about Michigan basketball in 2017-18, towards the end of the 2017 season when they went on their Sweet 16 run, something in Michigan basketball was different this past year than any time during the John Beilein era. There was a team that was mentally and physically tough, a team that played great defense, a team that was the big bully on the block. No longer was Michigan State going to win one of these games by simply out-toughing Michigan. Michigan was out-toughing its opponents. Was stronger than Isaac Haas at Purdue, was tougher than the guys at Maryland. That is what this Michigan basketball team was all about in 2017-18. And if you look at who that player was that I think really kind of sparked that Michigan basketball revolution, that is Mo Wagner. And the fact that the way that he changed his own game, he went from someone in the post where you weren't sure he was going to grab the rebound or body up to the guy because he was a 6'11", essentially, point forward. And instead he became I would say dominant, but he became a very, very good and I would say great defensive center in college basketball. And he also showed an ability to get to the basket. He showed, obviously, he could hit the three. He brought an energy and an excitement to Michigan basketball. I think Mo Wagner's legacy is going to be defined by how Michigan basketball has evolved and how going forward we're no longer going to be talking about. I don't know that we'll never have this criticism, but I don't think we'll be talking very often about a soft John Beilein team going forward. And I think that's Mo Wagner that led that way.
Well, what you just described, Michael, is a transcendent player. Trey Burke was a transcendent player. He brought John Beilein out of his modified offense and, introduced the high ball screen, the more of the NBA two-man game when you had a dominant, penetrating, point guard who could pick, pop, take it to the hole, could drive, dish, and he transcended Beilein's program. And to his credit, a lot of coaches would not let a player do that, particularly at this stage of their careers. But John Beilein let Trey Burke transcend his program, and you saw them get to the national championship game because of it. And it sounds like you believe that John Beilein let Mo Wagner transcend, maybe not so much the style in which they played, but the swagger that they played with.
Well, and absolutely, and certainly the way that Michigan basketball went about things. Michigan basketball became a team that played with more energy, more enthusiasm, more love for the game, more confidence on the floor, a little bit almost of the Michigan arrogance, I would say, where they believed that there was never a game that they weren't going to win, that if you came into their barn or they went into your barn, that it wasn't, they weren't having to play up to an opponent or play down to an opponent or be intimidated by the opponent. I really think they became the bully. And I don't know that John Beilein has been comfortable in his past of being the bully, But this year he almost sort of embraced it a little bit.
Yep.
Not that John Beilein's rolling up his sleeves and out there taking names and walking up to coaches and telling them, like, what's your deal or anything like that. But he certainly seemed to be okay with his players kind of getting in the faces of their opponents. And, John Beilein is such a humble guy, and he almost had to kind of say, like, okay, this is what's best for this team this year, is a little bit of this brashness that Jordan Poole plays with, that Xavier Simpson plays with, that Mo Wagner certainly plays with. And so I think that was a big part of this, was his own personal adaptation and allowing his players to say, this is the type of program we can be. So I really think when you talk about Mo Wagner, you look at then what he does offensively, you look at what he achieved in the big games, Michigan State on the road at the Breslin Center, against Purdue in the Big Ten tournament, Texas A&M in the Sweet 16, Loyola in the Final Four. He wasn't the guy that was taking the shots at the end of the game, but he seemingly was a big game player for Michigan. His legacy is going to, be very strong going forward. I think it's going to be something that we even appreciate more every year to come.
You know who he reminds me a lot of? Everything you just said. And the way he played, the swagger he played with, the edge he played with. He's the exact same size. He reminds me a lot of Christian Laettner. And, we saw Laettner when he returned for his senior year became a dominant player in the post when he was more of a wing shooter and a perimeter shooter and a guy who could drive to the basket against slower-footed bigs as well. That crooked smile that Mo has, Christian Laettner had that. That edge, that swagger. Laettner brought an edge and a swagger to the Duke program in the early 90s that, frankly, they didn't have with Tommy Amaker and Danny Ferry and a la Abdul Nabi. They were kind of the choir boys of college basketball at that time, sort of the way John Beilein's program has been looked at Michigan. And Christian Laettner brought that tenacity, that edge, maybe took it too far at times. But he brought that to the program and has a very similar skill set. Now, we'll never get to see if Mo returned for his senior year and developed that dominant post game to go with everything else that he had. But he reminds me a lot of Christian Laettner, Michael.
And something that I really liked about Mo Wagner, too, as much as we're talking about the idea of being a bully or not backing down from anybody, he played within the rules, too. It wasn't like he was Grayson Allen out there taking cheap shots. Guys are going to the basket, and he's, grabbing them across the arm and pulling them to the ground or tripping anybody or headhunting and clotheslining people. I mean, his most egregious, situation was him diving on the ground for a loose ball, wrestling it away from him, coming up and like flexing. Like, if that's as bad as it gets, then you've got a special player. And I really appreciate about him is that he never lost his cool. He seemed to get frustrated with the officials, but didn't get frustrated with his teammates, didn't get frustrated with the opponents. So he played the game the way that it was meant to be played, with a smile on his face, with an ability to hit the big shot, with a guy that would make it difficult on you in the post, a guy that rebounded. I mean, really, you get 5 Mo Wagners, and you're going to be very successful. And maybe when you look at this year's team, and the reason that they were so good is because his personality became kind of the team. There were 5 Mo Wagners on the floor during that NCAA tournament, during that Big Ten tournament.
Final thing then on basketball before we move on to football. We've got 6 more months to think about this, but what's your instant gut reaction to how this team looks going into next season?
I'm probably higher on them than most. I think when you've got the personnel that they have coming back, you've got a lot of guys that played important roles in the success of Michigan this past year, and at the same time have room to grow. Jordan Poole has a ton of room to grow. Isaiah Liberts has a ton of room to grow. Charles Matthews now understands how he can become the leader of this team, and at the same time, he doesn't have to put it all on his shoulders because Xavier Simpson's going to wear that mantle somewhat. When you look at it, John Teskey developed and is now someone that has more confidence. I look around the Big Ten, and everybody's losing somebody. Michigan State's got a good class coming in, but Michigan's a good class coming in. I think they're top 3 in the Big Ten. I think if some of those guys like Livers, like Poole, develop and take the big strides that we think they can between their freshman and sophomore year, and then it really comes down to you've got 5 freshmen coming in. You probably need 2 of them to really pop, to be better than we saw out of Poole and Livers this year, to be pretty special type of players as freshmen. Maybe like Burke and Hardaway were as freshmen during their careers, or Nick Stauskas and Glenn Robinson were during their careers. You need 2 of those 5 to really pop, and you need the other 3 guys to kind of play their roles. But I think they're top 3 in the Big Ten, and if those things come together, I honestly would not be surprised to see them win the Big Ten championship next year.
Well, I do think you kind of have to, even though Michigan's not a one-and-done program, where rosters at places like Duke and Kansas and Kentucky are reinventing themselves on a perennial basis now. John Beilein's ability to completely craft a team totally different from the one that we just saw the year before makes it a little bit more difficult to simply look at Michigan from the context of who's returning and who's not. You go back to the 2013 team, you had the team share the Big Ten championship in 2012, Stu Douglas, Zach Novak, who were kind of the backbones from a leadership perspective of those teams, move on. You bring in that outstanding freshman class with Stauskas and Robinson, and you saw John Beilein just completely reinvent a team. This year's team looks dramatically different than last year's team with Zach Irvin and Derek Walton really and Lanky Smooth there leading the way. And so John Beilein has shown he is very amorphous. He can. The real question isn't who's coming back and what they've done in the past. The real question is, can you look at the pieces and envision how John Beilein can put them together to be a formidable team by the end of the year? Because we have shown, even without the one-and-done factor, on a year-to-year basis, Michael, he can completely reinvent what this team did it from a year ago and how they won games the year before.
Well, and you bring up an interesting, not dilemma, interesting conversation to think about is, yes, how will he reinvent this team? Because he's really, the last 2 years with Moritz Wagner on the floor, he's been able to space opponents out because he's been able to hit, his 5 can hit 3-pointers. We saw it against Purdue last year when they completely took Caleb Swanigan and Isaac Haas out of the game because they couldn't defend Moritz Wagner. And you look at it this year, the spacing that was allowed to create the high ball screens, to create the matchups that they could get to the basket, whether it was Marr or Xavier or Charles Matthews, is so much dictated by the fact that Wagner's pulling his guy away, and that makes it better. Well, next year, your 5 is John Teske, at least looking at it as we are right now, and he's not a three-point shooter. What do you get out of Isaiah Livers and Brandon Johns at the 4? What do you get out of Iggy Brasdikis? What do you get out of Charles Matthews? Can Charles Matthews become a greater three-point threat? Because John Beilein is essentially, he's always been a guy that emphasized the three-pointer, and what we're seeing is every other team now emphasizes the three-pointer, and he's got to have that in his offense. He's got to have guys that you have to respect out there to pull the people away from the basket. So I'll be really curious about that, because when you look at their point guard in Xavier Simpson and who you expect to be their 5 in John Teske, those are 2 guys that don't shoot the 3. In Xavier Simpson's case, he shoots it. He just doesn't shoot it very well. Teske hasn't really shot it at all yet in his career. So will those guys become better three-point shooters? Do you get more from the 2, 3, and 4 on the floor? Like, how is that going to look? I think it's going to be really interesting, but I have complete faith in John Beilein to get the job done.
Let's move on and talk some football with Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor here on this week's season finale of Michigan Podcast. Let's start with the Amazon documentary. I'm through 6 of the 8 episodes, and I went into this in detail in the opening salvo of the program this week. But in short, just to reset and tee it up for you, Michael, I think this is brilliant narrative casting. And I've been dreading watching it, like a lot of fans, not wanting to relive this last season. And the fear was, particularly in, let's face it, the era we live in politically, it seems like every side is just lacks total self-awareness of their own weaknesses and leads with their chin, right? And it's nauseating to watch people just expose themselves as hypocrites routinely. I was afraid that was going to happen when I watched this, that we were going to try and put lipstick on a pig. They didn't do that at all. They showed us more of the team's warts than I ever thought we would see, and then they found a way to cleverly spin them as in, well, Drevno's gone, that's why we barely featured him. It's like Greg Fry was never even on the staff. All these quarterbacks, the young guy returns, but the other 2 guys are gone. They basically checked, it's like they read our message boards. And they found like the knowledgeable fans on all the message boards, and they said, all right, this is where our fans think we went wrong, and they just checked every box of every knowledgeable fan theory of what went wrong to answer all of those narratives to create sympathy and set it up to say, maybe they do get it, and maybe they are set up to be better next year, and they did make the right changes and adjustments. They have totally changed the narrative of this offseason, which after that Outback Bowl looked like it was going to be 2 words, brother, brutal. They used this documentary. They showed us more of what went on than I ever thought they would, and they did it in a way to their advantage. And I'm not being critical. I'm extremely complimentary of it, because I'm hoping that if the same people responsible for the savvy editing of this Amazon documentary are the same people who took a look at what this team needed in the offseason and made those changes, then that might actually bode pretty well for this fall, because I think this is one of the most brilliant examples of narrative casting I have seen in modern media.
Well, I was so impressed that they were able to make the 3 quarterbacks the Wicked Witch of the West.
Exactly.
I mean, my goodness, like they and to your points, I mean, and you and I have talked about this, and we've agreed. I mean, you're right. This was brilliant, brilliant propaganda, brilliant marketing, and they laid the 2017 football season. They picked it up. It's like if you could picture, a heaping pile of poo. They picked it up and they just dropped it right in front of the 3 quarterbacks and said, "God, look what you guys did. You made a mess on the field here." and I mean, from the moment, and here's the thing is that, Mark Harmon is the guy from NCIS, and Tom Harmon's was his grandson or his son?
His son. Yeah.
It's his son, which is crazy. But he's narrating this thing, and I'm sure that they wanted to pursue the quarterback angle, whether Michigan gave it to him or not. But the way that it was crafted, the way that Michigan probably helped with the editing process. What is the very first episode? The very first episode launches into this whole quarterback thing, and they're interviewing Harbaugh, and they're interviewing Pep Hamilton, and Tim Drevno makes a small appearance, and they're talking about, gosh, I just don't know. I don't know which quarterback it is. And frankly, we should have gone into the 2017 season with it being 100% this is Wilton Spate's job. He's coming off a year where he had, thrown for, 2,700 yards. He had the injury at Iowa that set him back.
He was third-team All-Big Ten, Michael.
Yeah, he's 9-0 going into November. He's ranked number 2 in the country. This is your guy. And instead, it gets played up about the fact that there's this huge debate. Now, the funny thing is, Steve, and I don't know about you, but I talked to enough sources. I don't really feel like when we were talking to people last year that they were really truly debating between John O'Korn and Wilton Spate. From everything that we heard, by the time they got to week 3, it was clear that it was Wilton Spate. And now here you go back and look and see that, it was really a toss-up between these 2 guys. I think that was done to go back and say, hey, we did not have the quarterbacks.
Yep.
They're kind of hamstrung by the quarterbacks. Even the Savior comes in, and Brandon Peters. And one of the key pieces of video in that whole Amazon Prime series is after he gets knocked out of the Outback Bowl. I know that you haven't gotten quite in there yet. But he gets knocked out, and you have Pep Hamilton on the phone trying to coax this kid to go back into the game. And you're essentially saying, hey, we had one guy in Wilton Spate that was too worried about the distractions. We had a second guy in John O'Korn that I think you've referenced before is kind of out to lunch talking about his NFL career when they're losing to Ohio State. And then you have a third guy that's just a mental midget in Brandon Peters and is not ready to handle this type of thing. So, guys, give us a free mulligan here. We'll do better this year. We have Shay Patterson. We have Joe Milton. We're trying to rehab Brandon Peters. We got Dylan McCaffrey. It's all about the quarterbacks. It was outside of our control. Give us another chance.
When I figured out what they did, it starts off because then I went back. When this moment happened, I went back and reviewed how I thought about every episode. I mean, the opening episode also takes us to Rome. The whole idea that Rome made the team soft, that they don't deserve these trips. And they point out by the time that ends, you think that's really the only good thing that happened last season was that trip and how great it was. And then they even have Mark Harmon say in the middle of the trip, this is going to be a challenging season for Michigan. It's the youngest team they've ever had. I mean, they set it up perfectly. And the moment that it clicked for me, Michael, that this is what they were doing was when after Tariq Black gets hurt and they let us see Harbaugh walk into the team meeting room and tell the entire team, we just lost our best wide receiver. All right? When they let us see that amount of breathtaking honesty, that was my epiphany. And that's what made me think, holy cow, this is brilliant. They're letting us in to reaffirm our own biases, to convince us that this is the right narrative of what happened last season, instead of fighting us, instead of fighting the fans and saying, no, you weren't seeing what you thought you were seeing. They are affirming us. They're like, yep, you guys are smart. You saw everything you thought that you saw. And by the end of this, you're going to be convinced we spent the offseason fixing it. That I just thought, again, I thought it was brilliant, Michael.
Well, one thing that I'm a little curious about, though, is they spend very little time talking about the offensive line. I mean, they spend so much time talking about the quarterbacks. You're right. They mentioned the Tariq Black thing, which I thought was stunning.
But they addressed that too. They did that with Grant Newsom too, with how, what a gruesome injury this was, how promising he was, what a great young man this is. So again, this idea is put out there that if he were there anchoring left tackle, the rest of these pieces would have fallen into place. They even addressed it in another more subliminal way rather than taking it on head on, probably because unlike at the quarterback spot where O'Korn and Spath are gone, a lot of those linemen are back. So they probably didn't want to throw a lot of guys under the bus before they were done developing them yet.
No, that's true, and I can understand that. But if they're looking for an excuse, that was a really good one, was to point to the offensive line. But the Tariq Black thing, I mean, could you imagine your coach 3 games into the season standing in front of your entire team and be like, hey, we just lost our best wide receiver, and telling that to the guys that are still there? I was shocked by that comment from Jim Harbaugh. I think what it just goes to show you is that Jim is who Jim is. And we got to see a lot of Jim Harbaugh in this documentary. Some good, some bad, some a little strange. Certainly some of his stories that he tells his team before games. I don't know that I'd go out there and want to run through a brick wall like I would for Don Brown or for like John Harbaugh or for Jack Harbaugh. At the same time, like, some of the stuff, like, I thought have you been to the part, I don't think you are yet, in episode 8, I believe it is, or episode 7, where they work with Steven Spinellis on becoming a center?
I've not seen that yet,
and so here's a guy who's played guard. Yeah, he's played guard his entire career so far, and they're going to the bowl game, and they're a little worried about depth at the center position, and so they teach him how to be a center. And I think, like, showing Jim Harbaugh one-on-one with players, showing Jim Harbaugh, there's a scene earlier in the show where I think he's showing Brandon Peters how to hand the ball off. And the one-on-one, like, his actually coaching guys up is at such an elite level. He sees the game and he can relay the game to these players on a one-on-one, or even like to like some of his guys all at the same time. That stuff is incredible. His passion that he has on the sideline, working with guys when they're on the sideline, I think is all really good. I think the pregame stuff is not very good. But at the same time, I think pregame speeches are a little bit overrated, because if you do your job Monday through Friday, you don't generally have to go in there and win one for the Gipper in order to get your guys motivated to go out there and beat the team that they're supposed to beat. It really comes down to whether or not you have the right game plan to institute, and whether at halftime you can make some adjustments, and then whether you've coached your guys up. And a lot of those things that I'm talking about, he coaches them up. He has the passion. They make some adjustments. They didn't quite make enough, and they didn't maybe have the right game plans. But at the same time, quarterback, they all took a dump on the field, and that's what Michigan gets across in this Amazon documentary.
All right, so finally now let's take a look at the 2018 Wolverines. We were supposed to get our first glance last Saturday with the spring game, but Mother Nature intervened, as she has on a lot of spring games throughout the country, even some in the South that they played. I mean, the game I tried watching Auburn's spring game, and I mean, it was just terrible even down in Alabama. I mean, a lot of the country weather is wreaking havoc, and so you don't really get a lot out of these spring games. Several schools in the Big Ten and the Midwest canceled theirs, but I think people get more out of spring games. Well, let me say this: you don't get a lot out of spring games when the weather's that bad. But my experience has been, and I've covered several college football teams in my career, and my experience has been the framework of the team you are coming out of spring is what you will be in the fall. Individual players improve. Coaches make adjustments when certain plays become bread and butter plays in the middle of a season, and they cast aside other things. You get bye weeks, and maybe you have a specific trick up your sleeve for that opponent. But the framework of the team you are coming out of spring. I'll just give you several examples for Michigan. When we came out of the spring game last year, what was the story? They couldn't protect Wilton Spate. The defense looks like it's not going to skip a beat. And Brandon Peters looks like he throws the ball a lot better. What did we talk about all last season? Those things. I go back to 2000. Yeah. I go to 2015. Harbaugh's first spring. And Jake Rudock hadn't arrived yet. Hadn't come until June. And we were like, boy, watching this spring, really hope Jake Rudock shows up as everybody thinks. And he was essentially the difference in the season, the way he played down the stretch. I was invited by a buddy of mine, Brady Hoke's first year. I went to his first year of spring practice heading into 2011, and I got to see the two close scrimmages that they held before the spring game when they went full contact, and could see right away that was going to be a very underrated defensive line with Mike Martin and Ryan who's the other young man? I can't remember his name. Ryan something was a good player on that team. And Van Bergen, thank you. You had Will Campbell on that defensive line. They were tenacious, unblockable, even against Denard Robinson in the two scrimmages that I saw. What did we see that season? The defense was hugely improved under Greg Madison in year one of Hoke, and it was led by which unit? The defensive line. I go to 2010. Before that season, you had the competition between Tate Forcier and Denard Robinson. Remember that spring? And Denard Robinson was putting up video game numbers in that spring game. And what did he do the first month of the season when we got to the actual games? Remember that game against Notre Dame? He was leading the nation in total offense. The first spring of Rich Rodriguez, we came out of there and thought, boy, we don't have a quarterback to run this offense. We got to the season. What happened? We don't have a quarterback to run this offense. So they don't tell you everything, and I think fans go in thinking that they do, and that's where they read too much into it. But if you understand that you're looking at a framework, you're looking at a snapshot of the team. It doesn't tell you everything, but it gives you a pretty holistic, if not specific, glance of what they have. I think they're more important than people think. I just think they put too much into them, and so they don't get enough out.
No, I think you're spot on, and I think if we're going to take the narratives of the spring, now it's a little bit harder because we didn't get to see with our own eyes,
right?
And you're relying on some practice reports, some of what the players are telling you, some of what the coaches are telling you. But that's one of those moments where, and I thought this was good, that if you go look at the media and you look at the comments that coaches and players make, like look at the people that are showing up consistently in those comments, because those guys are clearly showing up in a positive way for the Wolverines. And so if the narrative follows along that track and what we've heard from people that have been at some of the practices and some of the scrimmages, then there's reason to be excited about Shay Patterson and the fact that Michigan has more playmakers along the offense, whether we're talking Tariq Black, Oliver Martin, Zach Gentry, than they have in the past. What scares the bejesus out of me, Steve, is that almost every conversation that I have with someone, there's two things. One is outside of Shay Patterson, the best quarterback on Michigan's roster this spring has been true freshman Joe Milton. And from everything I understand, they don't want to play Joe Milton. They want him to redshirt. They don't want to have a season where their starting quarterback at any point is a true freshman, even though clearly true freshmen, as we saw in the case with Georgia last year, can be pretty successful. So that's my one, both positive and negative. Shay Patterson looks great. The rest of the quarterbacks don't. And the second thing is that keep on hearing still about the right tackle and left tackle for Michigan. The interior of Michigan's offensive line, how good Cesar Ruiz, Ben Bredesen, and Michael Onwenu are going to be. Who are the guys at right and left tackle? They're still trying to figure that out. They're still hoping that one of these redshirt freshmen, James Hudson, Chuck Filiaga, Andrew Stuber, takes the reins there, because the guys that are currently there, Joan Bushell-Beatty and John Runyon, are limited by their ceilings. And so that's where I'm at, where I'm going like, okay, there's some good coming out of this. The playmakers, there's a lot more playmakers this year, and they didn't have hardly any last year. The running game with Karan Higdon and Chris Evans certainly looks pretty good, and the quarterbacks do, but the tackles are still an issue, and the backup quarterback position is still an issue. So for me, it's like I want to be positive, but if they can't protect their starting quarterback based on what we're hearing, they're in trouble because their backups aren't very good.
You mentioned Joe Milton. They don't want to have to play a freshman quarterback. 4 teams have played in the last 2 college football national championship games. 3 of them were quarterbacked by true freshmen. Alabama with Jalen Hurts in 2016. And last year, when Hurts got benched for Tua Tagovailoa, we ended up having a battle of freshman quarterbacks between Tua and Jake Fromm. Now, those 3 all have something in common. They were all rated slightly higher recruits than Joe Milton was, who was considered a mid 4-star, top 150 kind of player. Those guys were all consensus top 100 recruits. And in the case of Tagovailoa, he was considered a 5-star prospect. But those 3 guys were all there in the spring, as Joe Milton was as well. So I don't think he's in the picture unless Shay's not eligible. And since I get a million questions about this, and you do this every day, which means you're getting 10 million, I've believed all along he was going to be eligible. But I'm curious. I know they're saying it, but I'm curious how they're behaving. Have you gotten word? Is he getting starter reps in spring, or in spring, is that not as big of a deal as it is in the summertime? I guess what I'm asking is Harbaugh behaving? Are you hearing in practice, are they behaving like they expect Shay to be the starting quarterback?
They are. They completely are. Now, they've gotten a couple of times here and there where Brandon Peters is going up against the ones defensively. But from everything that we've been told, yes, Shay practices with Tariq Black. He practices with Donovan Peoples-Jones. He's on the field for Zach Gentry. He's on the field for Cron Higdon. They know that they have something special, potentially special, I should say, when Shay Patterson's on the field. So they are really kind of banking on it being the case. Now, by the time that they get to fall camp, they'll know one way or another. They should know in the next couple of weeks here whether Shay Patterson is cleared by the NCAA to be eligible or not. And so they can kind of, reposition themselves if he's not. You tell the guys in the summer, hey, you got to work with Brandon, you got to work with Dylan, you got to work with Joe Milton, and we'll be okay when we get to fall camp. But, they certainly think he's going to be eligible. They are planning on him being eligible. They're building this offense around him being eligible. So let's just all keep our fingers crossed. And if you're a praying person, I would get down on your knees and pray that Shay Patterson is eligible for Michigan in 2018.
All right, one last question then. About a month from now, Vegas is going to come out with their preseason over-unders for every college football team. And if you look at the early odds for the national championship, depending on which sports book you look at, Michigan is somewhere between 8th and 12th in the minds of the folks out in the desert that I always maintain know more about this stuff than any human alive. So if they think they're somewhere between 8th and 12th, my guess is they're going to make Michigan's over-under win total for this fall around 9 or 9.5. Let's say it's 9.5. Let's say it's 9.5. Gun to your head right now. Are you taking the over or the under?
If Shay Patterson's eligible, I'm taking the over. If he's not, I'm taking the way under.
Way under? Wow.
Yeah. If he's not eligible, I think they're a 8-4 football team this year as their ceiling.
Well, you just described why I keep telling people that watch us here on Michigan Podcast, I have no prediction on next season until I know the answer to Shay, because I don't have a body of work for any of the other quarterbacks yet that give me confidence. I know what Shay can do. This is going to be a top 5 defense in the nation. I think the offensive line will be better because it can't be worse than getting 3 quarterbacks killed. Okay, so it's going to get better just by virtue. There's no other way to go. What I need to know, because to me, if you go into South Bend, Mike, with Shay Patterson at quarterback, you have the best quarterback and the best defense on the field. You win 90% of the time when that is the case. Winning that game is probably the difference between being in the playoff New Year's 6 conversation at the end of the year or not. That's the difference between 9-3 being your floor, or as you said, maybe being an 8-4 team. So that's why I need to know his status before I start predicting what's going to happen here starting September 1.
100% with you. I can't. Because we get asked about it, as you said, 10 million times per day. But I cannot make an accurate prediction for this Michigan football team until I know about Shay Patterson. honestly, it's going to be very hard to make a prediction anyway, just because we didn't see a spring game. We didn't see these guys live. We don't really know what we can see with our own eyes. I mean, that's the hard part for me, is going off of other people's impressions. I don't know where other people's biases come into play. I know where my own biases come into play. I know what I can see with my own eyes. If you watched the spring game last year, as you said, there were some legitimate concerns, and we saw them all play out. So you don't really know right now, but you can look around at the other teams in the Big Ten. You can look around and say, okay, Michigan's got this great defense come back. You know, I had a post on 24/7 Sports, the Michigan Insider, earlier this week, talking about how much experience Michigan has coming back on the offensive side of the ball. You can kind of project a little bit, but until I see Shay Patterson with my own eyes, I mean, for me, it's like I almost want to watch the Notre Dame game. You give me the Notre Dame game, let me watch that. I can make a prediction for the rest of the season after that. But until I see that game, or unless they invite us to the scrimmage in the fall, which, knowing Jim, is not going to happen, it's going to be really hard to say this is how they're going to be this season.
Michael Spath, WTKA in Ann Arbor. Always appreciate your contributions here on the Michigan podcast. Michael, appreciate the work you do there at WTKA every morning. Hope our audience tunes in as often as they get a chance. Go Blue. Thanks for joining us again.
Appreciate it. We look forward to talking to you on Friday.
All right. Take care. More Michigan podcast in a moment. This week's Twitter poll, we asked you, after watching the Amazon series on Michigan football's 2017 season, has your excitement level for this fall changed at all? 49% of you, almost a majority, said you're now more excited. 36% said no change. 15% said less so. So, mission accomplished. This reality show did exactly what it was intended to do. Again, bravo to Michigan for making that happen. Question of the week comes from a lot of you. So what's the plan for Michigan podcast between now and this fall? This is the season finale. We will return. We don't have a launch for season 2 yet, but it will come later on this summer. In the interim, you'll be seeing what we'll call Michigan Podcast Extras, MP Extras. We'll talk, for example, after the NFL draft, Michigan players, where they were selected, how they fit in. When we get final word on Shay Patterson, you'll have an MP Extra about that. In May, we're going to give you a chance at the end of the academic year to name your Wolverine of the year. So we've got several really cool ideas of MP Extras, mini episodes you'll be seeing between now and the launch of season 2 coming up later on this summer. I want to thank all of you, our producer here, Aaron, who puts this together every week, all of you that watch and share and like here on YouTube and subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play. Detroit Sports Podcast, which helps us to get the word out about this every week. Michael Spath at WTKA in Ann Arbor, Chris Ballas, John Borton at the Wolverine, and all the others that have appeared on here throughout the course of season 1. We could not have done it without you. Thank you so much. It's been a blast. We're not going anywhere. Stay tuned right here and go Blue.